In the skies of World War II, survival belonged to speed, armor, and firepower. The German Luftwaffe ruled the air with sleek Messerschmitt fighters. American bombers flew like steel fortresses. Every plane was built for destruction, dominance, or defense. But hidden beneath this thunder of engines and explosions was a flying machine so small, so slow, and so fragile that pilots joked it could be destroyed by a strong wind. It stood barely knee-high. No armor, no guns, no speed, and yet, this tiny aircraft outflew German fighters, survived direct enemy fire, changed the course of battles, and saved thousands of lives. This is the untold World War II miracle of the smallest plane that refused to die. At the beginning of World War II, military planners believed one thing with absolute certainty: bigger was better. Bigger engines meant higher speeds. More metal meant more protection. More guns meant survival. So when the U.S. Army considered using a civilian-style light aircraft for combat, many officers laughed. The plane was based on a pre-war civilian design meant for hobby flying. It had fabric wings, a tiny engine, and landing gear that looked like bicycle wheels. Pilots could literally step over it. The aircraft was later known as the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, but at first it wasn't meant for war at all. It was slow, painfully slow. Its top speed barely crossed 85 miles per hour. Slower than many German bombers, let alone fighters. It carried no weapons, no armor. And if a bullet hit the engine, the flight was over. By every military standard, it was useless. Or so everyone thought. World War II was not just a war of air superiority. It was a war of information. Knowing where the enemy was, how fast they were moving, and what they were preparing mattered as much as bombs and bullets. Traditional reconnaissance aircraft flew high and fast, but that came with problems. High altitude meant clouds, poor visibility, and delayed intelligence. By the time information reached ground commanders, it was often too late. The U.S. Army needed eyes close to the battlefield, aircraft that could fly low, land anywhere, and communicate instantly with troops below. That's where the tiny plane entered the war. It could take off from a field no bigger than a football pitch. It could land on dirt, grass, roads, even frozen rivers. It could fly slow enough to observe individual enemy soldiers. And most importantly, it was cheap and easy to replace. What seemed like weakness was actually its greatest strength. Flying the L-4 was nothing like flying a fighter. There was no speed to escape danger, no guns to fight back. Survival depended on skill, nerve, and intelligence. Pilots were trained to fly low, sometimes just 20 or 30 feet above the ground. They followed rivers, hedgerows, forests, and shadows. German radar often missed them completely because they flew too low and too slow to register clearly. Enemy fighters searched the skies for fast-moving aircraft. The tiny Grasshopper simply didn't fit their expectations. German pilots often reported seeing birds, gliders, or civilian planes. Many ignored them until it was too late. This is where the miracle truly begins. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were incredibly fast, too fast. Their engines were designed for high-speed combat. When they attempted to chase the tiny plane, they faced a deadly problem. At low speed and low altitude, German fighters stalled. They couldn't slow down enough without losing control. If they tried to match the Grasshopper's speed, their wings lost lift. If they pulled up, they overshot the target. The L-4, flying effortlessly at slow speeds, simply turned, dipped, or hugged the terrain. The fighters zoomed past, unable to line up a proper shot. The smallest plane in the sky became untouchable. German ground troops often fired at the Grasshopper with rifles and machine guns. Bullets punched holes through the fabric wings like paper. But here was another strange advantage. Because the wings were fabric, bullets often passed straight through without exploding or damaging critical components. Pilots returned with aircraft that looked like flying, Swiss cheese yet still airworthy. Mechanics patched the holes with fabric and glue. Within hours, the plane was flying again. A fighter hit by the same fire would be destroyed. The L-4's most deadly weapon wasn't a gun, it was a radio. From the sky, pilots spotted enemy tanks, artillery, and troop movements. They then guided American artillery fire with shocking precision. One pilot famously adjusted artillery fire so accurately that German units believed they were being observed by spies on the ground. They had no idea death was being directed by a plane that barely made any noise. Entire German batteries were wiped out by artillery guided by a plane they could barely see. On D-Day, while the world watched beaches erupt in chaos, Dozens of tiny grasshoppers flew silently above Normandy. They spotted German counterattacks forming behind the lines. They identified hidden artillery positions targeting Allied troops. They directed fire that saved entire beachheads from collapse. Many pilots flew for hours under fire without landing. Some were wounded. Some planes were barely holding together. But they kept flying, because if they stopped, thousands on the ground would die. In some cases, pilots landed inside combat zones to evacuate wounded soldiers. The plane wasn't designed for it, but desperate times demanded desperate courage. A single pilot would land under fire, load a wounded soldier beside him, sometimes sitting on the floor, and take off again with bullets snapping around them. No armor, no protection. Just faith in a fragile machine. Many soldiers owed their lives to a plane that looked like a toy. German intelligence struggled to understand the threat. How could such a slow aircraft be so effective? Why couldn't fighters destroy it? Orders were given to shoot them down, immediately. But it was easier said than done. The plane flew too low for heavy weapons, too slow for fighters, too small for radar. It existed in a blind spot of modern warfare. The Grasshopper didn't just damage German forces physically, it broke them mentally. Troops reported feeling constantly watched. Any movement could be spotted. Any position revealed. Artillery could fall within minutes. The sky itself became an enemy, even when it looked empty. Fear doesn't need explosions. Sometimes it only needs silence. When the war ended, jets took over the skies. Speed became king again. The tiny plane was pushed aside, returned to civilian use, or scrapped. History books praised fighters, bombers, aces, and generals. The knee-high plane disappeared into footnotes. But veterans remembered. They remembered the buzzing sound overhead. They remembered artillery striking exactly where needed. They remembered being saved by something so small it seemed impossible. The pilots who flew the knee-high plane were a different breed. They were not chasing glory. There were no medals for dogfights, no headlines, no victory tallies painted on the fuselage. Most of them were former civilian pilots, farmers, mechanics, flight instructors, men who knew how to fly close to the earth. They learned to read the land like a map. Shadows, wind, trees, rivers. Their survival depended on anticipation, not reaction. If a pilot waited to hear gunfire, it was already too late. They learned to feel danger before it appeared. A sudden silence from the ground, a glint of metal, an unnatural line in the grass. They became invisible not because the enemy couldn't see them, but because the enemy couldn't understand them. Grasshopper pilots often flew so low that infantrymen could see their faces. Some waved. Others fired. Flying that low was extremely dangerous. A single telephone wire, a tree branch, or a fence post could kill both pilot and aircraft instantly. But flying higher meant death from flak or fighters. So they flew in the narrow space between and where fear lived. Pilots memorized villages, crossroads, and hedgerows. They followed cowpaths and streams. At times, the aircraft wheels nearly touched the crops below. German soldiers later admitted something terrifying. We could hear them before we saw them. And when we heard them, we knew artillery was coming. Not every flight ended safely. There were moments when German fighters did manage to line up a shot. In one documented case, a Messerschmitt dove at a Grasshopper repeatedly, firing short bursts. The pilot didn't climb. He didn't run. He landed. Right in the middle of a field, engine off, wings flat. The fighter screamed overhead at impossible speed, unable to slow, unable to aim. Minutes later, the Grasshopper took off again. That pilot later said, "The plane wasn't fast, but it could stop." The fighter couldn't. The knee-high plane redefined what an airfield meant. It landed on beaches, on roads, between trees, in muddy fields still warm from shell explosions. Commanders could call in a pilot, receive real-time intelligence, and launch artillery within minutes. The delay that once cost thousands of lives